And if you can't find it, or they won't find it for you, you're dealing with a heretic.
Amen.
Turn around and walk away as fast as you can.
Or if you're living in the 15th century, you can set them on fire, because that's what they did to heretics back then.
Bringing you law, gospel, and guns. Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio.
Hey folks, welcome to another edition of Armed Lutheran Radio, a podcast about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and what God's Word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode number 145, brought to you by Cook's Holsters, American-made custom Kydex holsters with a lifetime warranty and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Check them out at cooksholsters.com. Use the promo code ARMEDPODCAST, that's all one word, ARMEDPODCAST, and save 15% off your order at cooksholsters.com. All right, again, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here and making Armed Lutheran Radio a part of your week. You're getting a double dose of me today. Pastor Bennett is not with us. Sergeant Bill is not with us, so you're getting me, and then Mia, and then me again. So that's what's on tap for you today. I thought I would start out with something I saw in the news this week that says a lot about where we are as a country and the problem that we have when it comes to discussing gun violence. And both my commentary here at the beginning and Clinging to God and Guns a little bit later are related to this topic. Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin has said some things recently that have drawn some interesting responses in the media. He made some comments in a radio interview about the root causes of gun violence. And also, I think there was an interview with like a Q&A session at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm not entirely certain what the date of that video is. I saw that on Facebook this week, and then I heard this interview, this radio interview, or part of it, that the media is all up in arms about, where he talks about how we live in a culture that no longer values life and which celebrates death. He called it a culture of death. He talked about things like abortion and violence in movies and television and music and that kind of thing. He talked about, family and marriage, the breakdown of the family and marriage, and how we've simply lost a sense of shared traditional values. And so here's a quote from the radio interview, and then I want to share with you how the media responded to this.
We're a culture that celebrates death. We are. People don't like to talk about it or think about it, but we are. And it starts with everything from the kind of entertainment that we focus on. What are the most popular movies? Seriously, what's the most popular topic that seems to be in every cable television network, for example? Right. These television shows are all about what? Zombies. Seriously, I don't get it. I really don't understand that. I was never a big fan of space and science fiction either, but now it's all about zombies.
Well,
this is what we are. Do we celebrate death? And that may seem trite and simplistic, and how is that connected to anything? But when a culture is surrounded by, inundated by, rewards things that celebrate death, whether it's zombies in television shows, whether it's the numbers of abortions that we just indiscriminately think is just okay, tens of millions of people in recent years, and that's okay, that's just who we are, it's just for convenience. There's 1,000 justifications for why we do this. And whether people think those justifications are good or not, these are drips, drips, drips on the stones of the psyches of young generations that are growing up in a society that increasingly says this is normal and okay. And eventually, some of those young minds are not going to be able to handle it.
He talked about, watching zombie shows and how that was the most popular thing on television nowadays, and how he doesn't really understand the interest in those kinds of shows. That was the only thing the media focused on. Listen to these headlines. This from Newsweek. Republican governor blames mass shootings on zombies, abortions, U.S. culture of death, not guns. Chicago Tribune. Why so much gun violence in America? Zombies on TV, says Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin. Rolling Stone. Kentucky governor blames zombies for mass shootings in America. USA Today. Do zombie shows lead to mass shootings? Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin thinks so. So rather than analyze his actual argument, rather than listen to the whole interview and maybe even listen to some of the other things he said in other venues, they tried to present it as this absurd argument that we're killing each other because of zombies on television. Nothing else that he said mattered. They ignored the rest. Why? Well, because the media doesn't like his argument. To them, the culture is fine. We don't have a culture of death. Everything in our culture is just hunky-dory. Well, with the exception of conservatives and Christians and Trump supporters, everything's great. They intentionally dismiss or ignore his larger point, which he made fairly well in this, maybe not in the interview because I wasn't able to hear the whole interview, but in a Q&A session for the American Enterprise Institute, he talked about how society's changed, how music and movies and television and video games have all changed, how abortion is killing hundreds of thousands each year for convenience. And now we have celebrities. I don't know whether you saw this week, there was some celebrity that's hosting parties at her house celebrating abortions. We're not just talking about how this is a medical necessity or how this is women's health care or whatever. We're holding parties, we're releasing videos, we're producing television shows celebrating a mother's decision to kill her child before it's born. We've got growing support for euthanasia in parts of the country as well, and Bevin mentions that as well. So the sanctity of life at both ends of the spectrum, at both ends of the life cycle, is sort of under assault. We've rejected traditional American morality, the Judeo-Christian values that on which this country was founded, in favor of secular humanism. We've elevated human sexuality and personal pleasure without consequence or shame. We've elevated those things to the pinnacle of human endeavor. As the Bible says, we've rejected God and we worship the created and not the creator. We used to bring guns to school, Bevin points out, and I remember this. Nobody thought to use them on their classmates, though. So why is society different? Access to guns has become more restrictive in many ways. The mechanics and the killing power of the gun hasn't changed. So what has? Society has changed. Think back to what television was like, what movies were like when you were growing up. If you're my age, I'm going on 50. Remember what movies and television were like, what music was like when you were growing up. Compare it to today. Do you see the difference? If you don't, then you're probably not very old. But if you're my age, 40s and 50s, there's a marked difference. And over the years, we've seen these little, as Bevin calls it, these little drips, tiny indiscretions that we as society tolerated. They may have complained about, but never really did anything about. It used to be that you didn't say certain words on television. Now you hear all the bad words. Then it was the human nudity, violent murder, drug use. All those things are now very mainstream in our media. Certainly wasn't the case back when I was growing up. And I'm not trying to sound like an old fuddy-duddy here by saying, "Oh, back in my day," but think about it. Over the years, things change incrementally until today, anything goes. It's a constant drip as Governor Bevin calls it, a drip, 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 eroding our moral fabric. Television, movies, and music, like I said, they used to espouse a certain virtue. They used to celebrate what was good. They used to denounce what was evil. The lines between good and evil are now so blurred, and we're encouraged to just be you. Do you. You only live once, right? You can't judge me. I was born this way. How dare you judge me? And today, we're to the point where we wouldn't recognize evil if it walked in and shot us in the face. And when it does come in and shoot us, we blame everybody except for the evil person who committed that act. And since fixing society is A, not something that they care about, and B, even if they did, it's not an easy or quick fix, the left in this country really doesn't want to talk about fixing society. They just want to blame guns. And they try to discredit people like Governor Bevin by making his argument sound absurd. Mass shootings because of zombies on TV, that's crazy talk. Yeah. But celebrating a television show that makes virtuous the worst of human behaviors, like a high school teacher that becomes a meth dealer, or a television show where the hero, the main character, is a serial killer, or a zombie show where really it's all about how badly humans can treat one another. That's all just fine. Having kids sit in the basement playing games that glorify killing? No biggie. That's swell. Speaking of games, I'm a baby boomer, so I grew up with video games. My favorites now are sort of the open world games that let you wander around and see things and do stuff, and they're not scripted so much, and they let you make big decisions that change the outcome of the game in some way. The most recent example of this is a game called Red Dead Redemption 2. In all of the games that I like, games like Fallout or Skyrim or Mass Effect or Red Dead, in all of those games, you have the freedom to do good things or really bad things. And there are consequences for both. What you choose to do usually has an effect on something else down the road. But they usually, when it comes to bad things, they usually don't amount to much in terms of consequences. Sometimes they do. But in a game like Red Dead Redemption or Grand Theft Auto, if you wait long enough, your bad deeds are forgotten. Kill a whole town full of people? No biggie, just pay off your bounty and you're home free. Now, I like those games because they're not so scripted and your actions have consequences. But I'm nearly 50. And so I know what's real and what's not. I have real life experience where teenagers don't. So for a teenager still learning to clean their room and do their homework, or struggling to talk to girls, sitting in their basement playing these games all the time, they can skew your perception of reality. Now, you can go around and you can vicariously do things in these games that you would never do in real life, and you can suffer no real consequence for it. At some point, though, for some people, the fun of pushing the limits without consequence in a video game is no longer enough. And some kids decide to see if they can do it for real. There was a guy on YouTube, maybe a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. He posts gameplay videos from all the different video games that he plays. And he was recently banned from YouTube because of a clip that he shared from Red Dead Redemption. What did he do in this clip? His character murdered a suffragette. Now, for those in Rio Linda, a suffragette is a female activist for women's voting rights. So the game is set in the early 1900s. And the largest city in the game, which is patterned after New Orleans, there's this non-player character, is a woman who is a computerized version of today's militant feminist. She's loud and she's yelling constantly and she's screaming about women's rights. She's in everybody's face and she shouts and shouts and shouts and she never shuts up. And you can't have a conversation anywhere near that character, with somebody else, because her shouting kind of drowns it all out. And this YouTuber decided he'd had enough, and he just went over and capped her. And that video got him banned. Never mind that he posted videos of his character killing all kinds of people and animals indiscriminately, but because he killed a feminist, that got him banned. Now, I'm not suggesting that either one of those things is good. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that this is an example of just how screwed up society is when it comes to the sanctity of life. The other issue that nobody on the left wants to talk about is the destruction of traditional families. And Governor Bevin mentions this in his AEI question and answer video. And I'll share a link to that video and to some of these articles. If you think about it, mass murder is one of the sad consequences of the rise of no-fault divorce in this country, and that's certainly something the left doesn't have any problem with. When two people can break their vows and walk away from each other because they're just not that into each other anymore, and they leave their kids behind, divided up or in the middle of all of this, it leaves kids messed up. And trust me, I know how badly that can affect people, because my parents' divorce screwed me up. I'm nearly 40 years later, and I'm still dealing with the emotional scars from that split. When your dad decides that your happiness, that your family is not as important as his happiness, it shakes your foundation as a child, and it leaves lasting damage that's not easily undone. My friend, Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse, has written extensively about this. She lectures about this. The Ruth Institute that she founded and runs helps people deal with the aftermath of these kinds of breakups. And very few of the mass shooters since Columbine actually had a father in the home. And we see, when it comes to violence in the inner city, so many are without fathers. There's no easy fix for this. But there are some things that we could do to help reduce violence in this country, to change the culture. Because, like I said, you can't pass a law and everything is just hunky-dory and everything gets fixed. But there are things that we could do as a society that would start to move the ball in that direction. We could stop glorifying violence and death in the media. We could put an end to the genocide of abortion on demand. We could change the laws about no-fault divorce. We could fight human trafficking and sex crimes. We could put an end to the porn industry. We could celebrate traditional family values, the values of love and charity and compassion and sacrifice that we no longer really share in our movies and our television and our music. We could change that. We could stop sexualizing everything when it comes to women in media and treat them with the respect they deserve. We could end the war on drugs and reform our prison system, which has removed so many men from their families and left a generation of young people in our inner cities in poverty. We could stop calling each other Hitler when we disagree, and we could sit down and find ways to talk to each other again. Those are some ideas. You might have more, and I could probably come up with a few more off the top of my head, but I don't really have time. I got to get caught up on The Walking Dead because I hear they're going to smash in some Asian kid's head with a baseball bat tonight. I can't miss that. All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, Mia Anstein is back with us with a tip, followed by Clinging to God and Guns. You're listening to Armed Lutheran Radio, a proud member of the Self-Defense Radio Network. Check out all the great content, all the other great shows at sdrn.us. Let me take a minute to tell you a little bit about our good friends at G4G Guns. After surviving an attempted kidnapping and having co-workers robbed at gunpoint, Patrick and Cassie Coburn decided to get a gun for protection, and that led them to teach others about the need to protect themselves and to be proficient with firearms, and that led to the creation of G4G Guns. It's an amazing store and an even more amazing website where you can shop for any gun, ammunition, accessories from the comfort of your own home and buy without any gimmicks or credit card fees. If you want the personal touch, visit their store at 175 Bear Road in Van Alstyne, Texas, or stop by and see them at a gun show near you on the weekends. They're great people. They offer great service, great prices, an amazing selection, and no hidden fees or gimmicks. Check them out at g4gguns.com. That's G, the number 4, gguns.com. G4G Guns, the galaxy for great guns. g4gguns.com.
Up next, it's Mia's Motivations with Mia Anstein.
Hey there, it is almost halfway through hunting season in Colorado. Actually, by the time you're listening to this, we'll probably be down to our last rifle season in Colorado. But I know in other parts of the country, hunting season is either just beginning or it's in full swing, and a lot of seasons last until the end of the year. We do have some late seasons here. I will be helping on a mentored hunt that we offer through our local Safari Club International chapter. And in that, I'm going to be teaching at the range. The young man that I'll be teaching, he actually took my Hunter Ed class last week and he passed with flying colors. So I'm really proud of him for that. In Hunter Ed, we don't do a lot of what you have to do to actually be out in the field. We need to make sure you're safe, understand the rules, understand conservation, stuff like that. But really, there's so much that goes into learning how to hunt. I actually had a friend once that passed Hunter Ed and sent me a message, hooray, now I know everything I need to know for hunting. And quite honestly, in the required 10-hour class, you just cannot learn everything. So what I suggest is head out to the range, head out on hunts. One great thing, I talked last week about taking your kids along, but there's something that I kind of took for granted is I learned how to hunt when I was very young because my dad hunted and he would bring me along. So I learned, even though I wasn't the one doing the shooting, I wasn't handling the firearm, I learned a lot while I was out there just by watching, by observing, and by being there. And there's a few things that I plan to teach this youngster at the range. Some of them I've talked to you about before, breathing techniques, shooting positions, using devices to help steady your rifle, stuff like that is what I'll be talking to him about. But some other things that you will learn as you head out on the hunt, and I really want to remind you of, I finished my deer season. I didn't ever shoot a deer this year. I didn't really see a good mature buck, and no, I was not trophy hunting. I just didn't see anything that really qualified as a mature buck in my mind. And I already have an elk from archery season in the freezer, so it really wasn't as though I had to shoot one, but I did enjoy hunting a new area and learning new things. One thing about the area I hunted in New Mexico, and that you might find if you come hunting out west, is there were some long shots. And I used my Swarovski X5i scope on my 6.5 300 Weatherby Magnum. So that was a nice long range round, and optics. Optics are amazing. You can have the best gun with cheap optics and it's not going to help you. You need to get a good optic for the top of your rifle. But with that, you also need to learn how that rifle shoots and spend some time at the range, not just looking at the ballistics charts, but actually shooting the rifle, because there are a lot of things besides wind and thermals and such that can affect the path of your bullet when you shoot. Something that I learned is when you are shooting at 200 or 300 yards, that's kind of a short range. If I go out to mid-range, maybe 300 to 700 yards, there's a severe drop after you head out to that range. Even with that hot firing round out of that Weatherby, there's a big drop. Something else that you need to take note of when you're out hunting, especially in these later months in November, December, is the temperature. It can have a drastic effect on your shot. So remember that if you are sighting in and it's 70 degrees, which it was when I sighted my rifle in, and now it is frosty in the morning, it's been 25 degrees in the morning, that thicker, colder air slows down the flight of your bullet. Thus, it's going to drop sooner, so it's going to affect it. Maybe not so much at that 300 yard, maybe a little, but definitely when you get out to 500. So this is something that you need to learn and practice. I actually had a message from a friend just this morning, which is why I'm telling you about this, that shot an elk at 500 yards. In the morning, it's 25 degrees. Actually, they were up at 9,000 feet. It may have been even colder up there. And there might have been some humidity in the air that can affect the bullet as well, and completely missed the elk. So the good news is it was a complete miss. But the bad news is if that's you and you're attempting these long shots, and these are really mid-range. So this is why I don't suggest long range for hunting unless you have very much practice in it, because you don't want to wound the animal. You really want to have a good, clean, ethical shot. So keep that in mind and keep studying and always keep learning. Remember, the day you stop learning is the day that you're going to be 6 feet under. So remember, you're never going to know everything, and always keep learning. Please try to make safe, ethical shots and take someone else out in the field, either to the range or take them along on a hunt and share the experience with them. Have a great one. Bye, guys.
You can read more from Mia and watch her YouTube videos at miaanstein.com.
Hey guys, it's Mia here. If you follow me on social media, you know that I often share morning inspiration. Many people ask how I can keep this up every day. Well, it starts with my morning readings and that perfect cup of coffee. The official Dunkin' Donuts shop provides coffee lovers with everything they need, from K-Cup pods, original blended coffee, tea, drinkware, and more. Who doesn't want Dunkin' delivered to their front door? Shop today at www.armedlutheran.us/coffee and help support Armed Lutheran Radio today.
Let me take a moment to tell you about our good friends at cooksholsters.com. Not only are they a sponsor of the show and the Armed Lutheran Radio shooting team, they're a company that I trust and believe in. Why? Well, when I first got into concealed carry, when I got my concealed carry permit, it was really amazing how much I didn't know. I picked up a holster from my local range, one of those cheap prophylactic holsters, you know the kind. They collapse when you take the gun out. You can't reholster them safely. I have to admit, I was one of those guys. When I started learning more and taking classes and reading and watching videos, I found out that there are better holsters out there. I learned about the advantage of Kydex holsters, and that's how I discovered Cook's Holsters. What makes Cook so special as opposed to other holster makers? They make an outstanding product. They sell printed Kydex to many of the other holster makers, and their subsidiary business, Cook's Molds, actually makes the molds that other holster manufacturers use. Cook's Holsters is an American success story. Born in the founder's basement, Cook's Holsters grew so much that Mr. Cook left his job to make holsters full-time, and he hired people to help fill orders and meet demand. Custom molded to fit your firearm, Cook's Holsters are available in a wide array of colors and printed patterns, including your own artwork. They're available for carry, for range work, and for competition. Check them out at cooksholsters.com. They're adding new gun models every month. I trust them for everyday carry and for competition. Visit them today. Use the promo code ARMEDPODCAST and save 15% off your order. They offer a lifetime warranty and a 100% money-back guarantee if you're not satisfied. Check them out at cooksholsters.com.
Up next, we're clinging to God and guns with Pastor John Bennett.
Welcome back to Armed Lutheran Radio. Time now for Clinging to God and Guns, where we analyze the gun rights debate from a Christian perspective. We're normally joined by Pastor John Bennett, but he was unable to be with us this week, so I'm flying solo and looking at, again, the comments that Governor Matt Bevin made, governor of Kentucky, made about the root causes of mass shootings and what can we really do to to make a difference? What can we do to change things? And we talked in the earlier segment about how we can change, things that we could do to change society and the problems that we really face. But how do we stop mass shootings? How do we stop gun violence, so-called? The problem is that we have, with the gun debate, of course, we have this very polarizing issue that neither side really has any common ground to discuss. Both sides are in their corners and they have their preferred policy ideas and talking points, and there's simply no common ground. And with the Democrats who will be controlling the House next year, for them, it's no longer talking about gun control or common sense regulations. They're talking about confiscation. They're already talking a very big game, not just about reasonable gun safety legislation, but full bore confiscation. You probably saw this week this loudmouth congressman from California who said in a Twitter exchange that the U.S. military would use nukes on its own people if Americans resisted forcible confiscation of their firearms. Nuclear freaking weapons. Now, we do need to have a discussion in this country about violence and mass shootings, but I don't know how you have a conversation when one side is talking about nuking the other, literally annihilating the other. Neither side in this debate is willing to talk. They're not interested in talking. So how do you have a conversation when one side is willing to entertain dropping a nuclear weapon on its own citizens in order to enforce gun control? Once you do that, there's really no middle ground anymore. You've just proven why people support the Second Amendment. So how do we change this? How do we overcome this divide politically and actually try to do something when it comes to gun violence in this country? Because at the end of the day, both sides want to see a decrease. They both sides want to see a reduction in gun deaths. On the right side, we see the fundamental right, and the issue is as a matter of personal responsibility. On the left, your rights don't supersede their feelings. They don't see this as an issue of personal responsibility because on the left, you're not responsible for your own actions. Society is always to blame. Guns are to blame. So how do we make progress when both sides see the issue so completely differently? Scott Adams, the author of the book Win Bigly and the creator of the Dilbert comics, has described this divide as two movies on one screen. Imagine yourself sitting in a movie theater watching a movie, and half of the people in the theater see it one way, and the other half see it completely differently. One group's watching Bambi, and the other is watching The Deer Slayer, right? Al Gore once said, I think it was Al Gore, somebody correct me if I'm wrong here, that we have two Americas. And while he was wrong about the way he described it, he suggested that it was the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. We do live in two Americas, two groups of people who on every issue of consequence live in two completely different realities. We're divided on ideology and worldview, between logic and rational thought on one side and emotion on the other. Whether it's national security or voting rights or immigration or abortion, law enforcement or taxes or free speech or education, property rights, human sexuality, economics, and guns, the two sides in this country are looking at the same movie and seeing it completely differently. We're living in completely different realities. And as each day passes, there's less and less middle ground for us to agree on. So without any common understanding, how do we unite again? Aren't we just doomed to kind of swing back and forth on this perpetual political pendulum as one side or the other pushes their version of reality depending on who's in power? It just swings back and forth. And at some point, one side becomes so extreme, and I think we know, one side wants to keep things the way they are. The other side is just pushing it as far to the left as they can possibly go. And ultimately, if that keeps up, there comes a point where we simply can't coexist anymore. I mean, I hope it never comes to that, but I don't know how this ever gets resolved. And ultimately, I don't think it ever will. Certainly not in my lifetime. But on mass shootings and gun violence, particularly, let's talk mass shootings. I think we can agree on some basics. We on the right, on the pro-gun side, don't believe that nothing can be done. That's one of the false realities that the left believes. They have posited that because we don't agree with them on gun control, we must think that we can't or we shouldn't do anything, or that we love guns more than kids, that kind of stuff. And we on the right often argue that the left simply wants to ban guns because they want to control us. They want tyranny. And while for some, like that moron in California, that congressman, that may be true, the reality is that most of the people on the anti-gun side just don't know a whole lot about them. And like I've said, their only reality when it comes to guns is what they see in the media and in the news. And so they see things in a completely different way. But at the end of the day, they want the same things that we do, to save lives and to keep guns out of the hands of killers. The problem is we can't agree on how to get there. We have different ideas for how to get there. And politicians, the media, and political action groups on both sides don't want us to agree. They like the division. So how about we go back to the drawing board and we look at all of the ideas that are out there and we see what works. Now, let's start, though, by throwing out the most contentious issues, the things that we simply cannot come together on. Bans on semi-automatic rifles, universal background checks, bans on things like bump stocks, background checks or purchase limits for ammunition, waiting periods, putting an end to gun-free zones, national carry reciprocity, constitutional carry, the Hearing Protection Act. Throw those things out. They're at the extreme ends of the debate, and there's no ground to be gained initially in this initial conversation. I'm not saying that I support some of those things or oppose those things on that list. What I'm saying is those are hot-button issues. Those are hot-button topics that are going to take a lot longer to iron out. We got to find, the two sides are just so polarized on those questions. There's no debate or discussion to be had at this point. We need to find some things that we can agree on. So where does that leave us? It doesn't leave us with a lot, but there are a few things that we could talk about. Let's start with the media. We know that mass killers are driven in many cases by a desire for notoriety. Since Columbine, almost every mass shooting has been influenced, or both in the United States and to a large percentage in Europe as well, have been influenced or outright copied the killers at the Columbine High School. When a mass shooting happens, particularly at a school, that event is all we talk about for months, until another tragedy happens and takes its place, or the president tweets something provocative. Let's look at the Parkland killer, right? He assaulted a prison guard this week, and bingo, he's back in the news, photo and all. What if we could guarantee that these killers would never gain notoriety? What if we banned the publishing of the names or the photographs of mass killers? Now, initially, I would think this is something that we could get the media to voluntarily participate in, right? These publishing their names, putting their pictures out there, constantly, pushing them providing them notoriety. That's what future mass killers want. But since mass killings help push their preferred agenda, let's not forget that the media is not an objective party in all of this. Their preferred agenda is gun control, so they may not be so willing to do this. So we may have to propose some sort of legislation or regulation to enforce that. Oh no! What about the First Amendment? I'm sure some of you will shriek something like that, to which I would respond, you're willing to publish op-eds about abolishing the Second Amendment, but you want to use your First Amendment right to give the hope of notoriety and fame to future mass killers? Really? All right, second idea. Retroactively, I think we ought to expunge the names and photos of mass killers from the past. I don't know how feasible that idea is. I mean, think back, thinking about this made me think about ancient Egypt, of all things. Bear with me. Monotheism briefly replaced pantheism. For those in Rio Linda, again, worship of one god replaced the worship of many gods. during the reign of Amenhotep IV, who was a worshiper of the sun god Ra. He officially changed the religion of his kingdom and replaced the old gods with his preferred god. But when he died in 1347 BC, the worship of the old gods returned, and Amenhotep's likeness was carved and scratched out of every monument and mural throughout the kingdom, so they could basically wrote him out of history. Columbine, as I mentioned, continues to inspire future killers. So I suggest we should erase that evil, erase those perpetrators, and all who followed them from our collective history. But wait, we can't rewrite history. We can't rewrite the past, can we? The genie's out of the bottle. And besides, if we forget the past, aren't we doomed to repeat it? I'm not suggesting that we forget these events. I'm not suggesting that we ever forget Columbine or Newtown or Parkland. What I'm suggesting is that we erase the names and the photos of the killers from our history as much as is possible. We should never forget those tragedies and the people that we lost. But we should learn from each one of them so that we can prepare for what comes in the future. But the notoriety, the fame that these killers continue to gain, that ought to be forgotten. If Columbine 20 years ago is still inspiring killers to this day, I think it's worth it to basically erase those two pieces of crap from our history entirely if it's possible. I know, I don't think it'll ever happen. I'm not even sure it's feasible, but it's wishful thinking. It's something we could at least discuss and I think agree on. Third, let's come up with a definition for a mass shooting. The bogus Gun Violence Archive website uses any shooting where 4 or more people are killed or injured. They don't really distinguish. And they don't distinguish what the cause of that incident was. So that's how you get these, we've had 300 mass shootings this year. No, we haven't. The FBI definition is, I think, 3 or more killed in a single incident. But the Gun Violence Archive and places like Mother Jones include, gang-related shootings or drug deals gone bad or home invasion murders or familicides where, the father kills the whole family and then kills himself. Those things are horrible, but they're not the same thing as Columbine. They're not even in the same category at all. A mass shooting should be specifically defined by the government. We should define it as the injury or death of more than 3 people where the shooting is not related to the commission of another crime. Essentially, the shooting is the crime. That's the primary objective of the shooter. Not some drug deal, not a home invasion. The shooting itself is the primary purpose of the event. And then having agreed on what that standard is, we can look back and we can see more accurately what happens over time. We can look back in the past and we can better define what trends are, right? But then once the most important thing, once we have that standard definition, we need to make the perpetration of that act a death penalty offense at the federal level. We've seen, especially in light of the Brett Kavanaugh debate, we've seen numerous stories about people who were accused of crimes, served lengthy sentences for crimes they didn't commit, and lost large periods of their life sitting in prison for something they didn't do. So I've got some issues with the death penalty. The last thing I think we want to do is put somebody to death and find out later that, that guy was innocent. And I don't believe in the idea that it's better for society to break some eggs to make sure that the laws are upheld. So I have some issues. But in the case of a mass murder, a mass shooter where, come on, we all know who the shooter is. If they don't commit suicide or if they're not killed by police, we've got no doubts who they are, right? There's never been a mass killer who ever once said, that wasn't me, I didn't do it. And most of the time, 90+% of the time, they're doing it because they want to be recognized for it. They want the recognition. So their deaths should be swift and certain and public. And we should make sure that the death penalty for those people is a deterrent. Bring back the firing squad specifically for these mass killers. Make it public. Make sure these depraved people suffer death by the same means that they killed their victims. firing squad in public, and then a public display of their rotten corpse. I think we should bring back gibbeting as well.
I'm gonna stab you in the face, Patrick. Okay, that was probably a bit much.
But, you get where I'm going here. We should, instead of giving them the notoriety and the fame that they want, we should make sure that everyone knows the punishment they received and how horrible it was. Another proposal I would support would be, and I've talked about this before, I talked at length about this on another podcast, would be holding parents accountable, criminally or financially accountable, for allowing their kids unfettered access to a firearm if that child then uses the firearm to kill someone else, right? We know, for example, the Santa Fe, Texas high school shooter got his guns from his parents. Now, I'm not saying that's going to solve every problem, and it's a solution, I think, to a lot of problems when it comes to the misuse of firearms. How many times do we find out about, just this week, we had a child, find a gun under the pillow in his parents' bed and pulled the gun out and shot him or herself. In the case of a parent whose child kills himself or herself accidentally with a firearm, that's punishment enough in my thinking. But if they then if the child takes the firearm somewhere else and commits a crime with it, I think that the parents who allowed the child to get hold of the firearm should be held accountable. If you're a gun owner, you have absolute ultimate responsibility to keep it out of the hands of the wrong people, especially if you have children in the home. But so now while this rule isn't specific to mass shootings, it's really applicable to gun accidents in general, but it's one place in the gun debate that I think we could find some common ground. Now, I've heard someone argue, I actually heard the argument that you can't expect gun owners to buy safes because they're expensive. And my reply to that would be, you had the money to buy a gun, and probably more than one. So if buying a cheap, quick access safe is a problem, maybe your priorities are a mess. Maybe you need to rethink your priorities. On the other hand, you might support the idea, I've heard someone suggest the idea of a tax deduction or a credit for the purchase of a gun safe. But the downside to that, obviously, is it ties your ownership of a gun to your tax records and creates a de facto registry. So I'm not sure about that. But the responsibility lies with the gun owner. And if you've got kids in the house and you own multiple guns, but you don't own a safe, I'm going to paraphrase, I'm going to steal something that Rob Pincus said at NRA a few years ago. He said, if you own a gun and you haven't gotten any training, if you own, a safe full of guns, go sell a gun or two and pay for some training. I would also say, go out and get a safe to store your guns responsibly. If you have multiple guns and you don't have a safe, sell a gun or two and buy one. It's really not difficult. It's the responsible thing to do. And finally, I think we can find some common ground. This one's a little more tricky, in the idea of gun violence restraining orders. Now, hear me out on this. When a mass killing happens, we inevitably find out that the killer was known to authorities and nothing was done to prevent their access to firearms. Family members, friends reported them, said, hey, this person's a danger. In the most recent example, in Thousand Oaks, California, police showed up at his house and decided, you know what, we're not going to take his guns, we're not going to arrest him. And ultimately, he went on to commit a horrible murder in a nightclub. Politicians always seem to call for gun control that affects everyone, like massive corporal punishment on a national scale. But red flag gun laws, or these gun violence restraining orders, they're limited to specific threats to specific people and should be only requested by those who know the gun owner best. So it's very limited in its effect. Now, this is a touchy subject because while I like the idea in principle, I hate the idea in practice. I don't like any of the existing red flag or gun violence restraining order laws that are currently in force anywhere in the country. But the concept is sensible. The due process rights of the gun owner have to be upheld, though. Just having cops show up and take the person's guns is bad, and we saw how bad that can be when police in Maryland recently, I think in the last week and a half, killed a man when they showed up at his house at 5 a.m. to take his guns away. And in a struggle to take a gun away from him, the gun went off, didn't hit anybody, and another police officer who wasn't involved in the struggle shot and killed the gun owner. That can't happen. We've got to find a way to prevent that. As my friend Sean Sorrentino, formerly of the gun blog Variety Cast, says, if you're too dangerous to be allowed to own a gun, you should be locked up. If you want to take a person's guns, there's got to be just cause to detain them and to evaluate if they're mentally fit to own a firearm. You can't just have some jilted lover or ex-girlfriend or wife calling out of spite and having the police show up at the door. That's basically like swatting. I think the person targeted should be summoned to court before any action is taken. They should be evaluated by a judge, I think, and allowed to actually make their own case. They should be allowed to face their accuser. All of this before property is seized. And if they're too dangerous to keep their guns, then they shouldn't be out on the streets. Because what's going to happen when you take somebody's guns, if they're already dangerous, now they're pissed because you took their stuff. Now what are they going to do? Just because you took their guns doesn't mean they can't go out and get more or something else deadly. So these have to be done very carefully with the rights of the gun owner and due process in mind, because these laws are written by politicians, most of whom know about as much about guns and gun owners as Bernie Sanders knows about economics. So I don't expect there's ever going to be an example of a red flag law that I would support, but it's an area that I think we should be willing to discuss. There are probably ways to improve or replace the existing background check system as well, but the idea of universal background checks, like I said, not something we need to discuss. We need to take the system that we've got and make it work better, because how many times have we seen bad people slip through the cracks? We either need to replace it or we need to fix it. But Democrats generally kill any efforts to fix the NICS background check system because the proposal doesn't involve gun control. There are probably lots of other ideas that both sides could sit down and find some common ground on. What do you think? What do you think about the ideas that I've put forward? Are there others I didn't think of? Am I off my rocker? Visit our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback and let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear them. That's all we've got time for today. I really do appreciate you tuning in. Tune in again next time for another edition of Clinging to God and Guns, right here on Armed Lutheran Radio.
John Bennett is the pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. For more information, visit stjohnswillowcreek.org.
And that's going to wrap it up for this week's show. Thank you all for listening, for downloading, for subscribing. Thank you to our fine sponsors who make all this possible. Thank you to my awesome cast of contributors. And thank you, dear listener, for listening, for downloading, for subscribing. I hope you'll join us again next week. Until then, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Armed Lutheran Radio. For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, and TuneIn. This podcast is made possible by Cook's Holsters and contributions from listeners like you.